Welcome to Reykjavik, the capital of Iceland, for this new edition of the interview on France 24. My guest today is the President of Iceland, Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson, won a fifth term in office on the 30th of June, making him the longest-serving president in Iceland's history. In the past, Mr. Grímsson controversially opposed a government deal to repay Britain and the Netherlands following the so-called Icesave scandal. We'll ask him, of course, why he made such a decision. Mr. President, thank you for having us here at your residence on the outskirts of Reykjavik. Let's start with your victory. You were running against 5 other candidates, including a young and charismatic female journalist. You won the vote with more than 52%. Why do you think you made a difference?
Well, I think there are many reasons. Among them are that the people want to be sure that in the years ahead there is someone with experience, someone who is ready to take decisions, even if they are opposed by powerful forces. But I think perhaps above all, it was a support for my decision to hold a referendum on the Icesave issue. Not just because of the Icesave issue itself, but also because it paved the road towards a new form of democracy, where the people of our country can determine their fate in difficult economic times. So I see it more as a victory for the democratic evolution of my country in times of economic crisis, rather than a personal victory for myself.
It's interesting you're saying this because traditionally the President of Iceland was regarded as a sort of figurehead. You've sought to embolden this position and to act as a referee. Is this really what your position is meant to be?
Well, the term figurehead is a misleading term because the Icelandic constitution was designed in such a way when the republic was founded that the president was directly elected by the people. And by the way, the Icelandic presidency was the first in history to be directly elected by the people, that the presidency should be a counterbalance if the nation is unhappy with decisions taken by the parliament. And I think given the economic crisis that you see in Europe, you see the enormous difficult decisions that European leaders have to take. What has happened here in Iceland is an interesting, if not profound, demonstration of the conflict between democracy on one hand and the financial interest on the other.
Now, despite your opposition, the government of Iceland has already repaid half the debt it owes to Britain and the Netherlands. Was it a mistake?
What has happened is that the estate of the failed bank has been paying out of the assets that were inside that bank. So as it turned out, this private bank had sufficient assets within its estate to start paying out to the British and the Dutch depositors. It's not the government of Iceland that has paid. But it wasn't only the government of my country. Every government in Europe was against my decision. And I think it is something which the leadership of both the European Union and other European countries should reflect on. Why it was in 2009 that all of them supported these outrageous claims by the British and the Dutch, that the ordinary people of Iceland should repay the debt of a failed private Icelandic bank. And to give you a comparison, if you take the sum which these European governments were pressuring us to pay back, giving the relative size of the Icelandic and the British economy, it would have been equal within the British economy by asking the British taxpayers to pay over £800 billion. £800 billion because of the failure of a British bank, let's say in Spain or Italy or France or Greece. Nobody in their sane mind would accept such a demand.
Mr. Grimson, 4 years after the financial meltdown of Iceland, your country is growing again. The economy is poised to grow by 3% this year. How do you explain this surprise recovery?
Well, the success of the Icelandic recovery is also very interesting in the light of what everybody in Europe was saying with respect to the Icesave issue, because they were predicting that if I put the issue to a referendum, Iceland would be isolated financially, we would face economic ruins. Somebody even said we would be the Cuba of the North. Nothing of these doomsday scenarios became a reality. On the contrary, the success of the referendum helped to resurrect the Icelandic economy by giving the people back their self-esteem, their self-confidence, to give them a new vision of a different future. So here we are, almost 4 years after the banks crashed, with an Icelandic economy well on its way to recovery, unemployment among the lowest in Europe, and many of the most important sectors in the Icelandic economy paradoxically doing much better now than they were in the years leading up to the crisis. And I think it's a combination of the right economic policies, some of whom went completely against the prevailing orthodoxies of Europe or the Western world, and the democratization of the decision-making process.
The government of Iceland is determined to join the European Union. It's applied in 2009. You oppose the EU.
My position has been based on a few things. One is that we are part of the North Atlantic, of the northernmost part of Europe. Our neighbor to the west, Greenland, decided to leave the European Union. Our neighbor to the east, Norway, failed twice to get the nation to accept European Union membership. And also, when you look at Northern Europe, and you go from Greenland to across Iceland, over to Britain and Norway and Denmark and Sweden, it's not until you come to Finland that you find a Euro country. In fact, all of Northern Europe has decided to have its own currency. And if you add together our geographical position, as well as how our neighboring countries have opted for a different currency solution, and then you add the control over the fishing grounds, over the natural resources, it has always been my view that it was a better deal for Iceland, giving our geographical position and the nature of natural resources, to remain outside the European Union.
But the crisis revealed the vulnerability of your currency, the Icelandic crown. With high inflation, with high interest rates, wouldn't you be better off with the euro?
Well, I think everybody will acknowledge that one of the major lessons of Europe in the last 3 years, that the euro by itself is not a guarantee of any success. In fact, the Eurozone is the currency area that continuously in the last 2 years have faced the crisis and has had more crisis summits than any other region in the world. And paradoxically, although you could argue that prior to the financial crisis, when the banks were among the biggest companies in Iceland, you could then argue that the krona was perhaps a part of the trouble. But clearly, after the collapse and during the recovery, the krona has been a fundamental part of the solution. The fact that we could devalue the currency, we could make the export sectors, the energy sector, the fishing sector, the tourism sector, the IT sector more competitive, more progressive. One of the reasons why Icelandic tourism has grown tremendously every year since the financial crisis by 15 to 20% is our own currency. That we
devalued your way into recovery.
Absolutely.
Now,
that is the most classical and most effective way to a recovery.
Briefly, you explain why you sought to embolden the position of the President of Iceland. Will you seek to halt accession talks during your next term in office?
No, I have always respected the democratic will of both other institutions in Iceland, like the parliament, and the right of the Icelandic people to have a final say on this issue. But as I have said many times in Iceland, my friend, the foreign minister, will have a pretty tough task to get outcome of the negotiations that will be approved by the Icelandic people. Let's look at the fishing policy. Why is Iceland recovering? Among other things, is the success of our fishing sector, that we have sustained our fish stocks for decades, whereas you've seen a colossal failure in preserving fish stocks in Europe. And as all the ministers of fisheries in the European Union recognized about a year ago, the EU fisheries policy has been a monumental failure. For us, the fishing sector, as you know, is a major part of our currency earning machine. You could even argue there wouldn't be a republic in Iceland if it wasn't for the success of our fishing sector in the last 40 or 50 years. And therefore, the most crucial issue in these negotiations will be the fishing sector. And there, the fact of the matter is, the EU has faced up to the fact that their fisheries policy has been a monumental failure. And they have not yet, maybe they will in 1 or 2 years' time, been willing to acknowledge that the Icelandic policy is much better.
So we understand that the fishing quotas remain a bone of contention between Iceland and Brussels. Mr. President, thank you very much for talking to us. Thank you for watching this edition of the interview on France 24 from Reykjavik, the capital of Iceland. From all of us here, goodbye.